first speaker, Caroline from the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics and an active member of the Gender Data Network. So Caroline, from where you sit, what are some of the challenges and solutions to building a business case for disaggregated data inside the walls of an NSO? So Caroline, over to you. You have 8 minutes.
Okay, hello everybody. So my name is Caroline, as you've heard, from the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, and I am a gender statistician. And today I'll be speaking to you about some challenges that we face as an organization and also as a gender statistician in terms of having disaggregated data. So I'll actually do that quickly because I have while other participant is sharing. So I think you need to, so that I can have my PowerPoint presentation. Yeah, good. All right, so I'll start with the challenges. And one of the challenges that we face as a bureau is the fact that majority of our data producers and users, they lack awareness on the importance of disaggregated data. So, and some of these importance actually include the contribution to inclusivity and essentially in leaving no one behind, which is basically the principle for the Agenda 2030. And another importance of disaggregated data would also be in allowing for a better understanding and tracking of the progress made for the SDG goals for a better sustainable future. And not forgetting also that this data that is disaggregated also is used to inform evidence-based policies and investment. And when it comes to gender statistics, it is also very essential in helping us in addressing gender inequalities in various domains. So secondly, in terms of human capacity, we suffer some challenges in terms of inadequate, qualified, and competent staff with specialized skills on data production and data use. And when you talk of skills, we mean skills in creating successful and proper survey designs. We also lack skills in literacy, data literacy skills, which is basically the ability to read, write, and how to use analytical methods and techniques, and also how to communicate the data in context in which it's going to meet the various users. We also lack skills in handling alternative data sources, such as the big data and what we refer to as citizen-generated data. Bringing this closer to home, also some of our gender focal point persons in various data production entities in our NSSS, they lack skills in handling data, and also they do not know how to properly advocate for gender-related issues. So another challenge that we also face is in the harmonization of statistical activities within our national statistical system. For a long time, we've not been having a framework which is clear for coordinating the entire NSS, which is essentially done through implementation of a national strategy for development of statistics, which we call in short the NSDS. However, we're in the process of launching our first generation of NSDS, which has incorporated different sector statistics plans. And one of the statistics plan is our gender sector statistics plan, upon which full implementation will be able to help us in coordinating the entire gender sector. And we've also managed to incorporate the non-state actors, which more or less they are usually left out. And this is also going to help us in identifying and filling the gender data gaps, among other issues in the gender statistics sector. So another very key issue is we lack or we have very limited financial resources. Financial resources are very essential. As we all know, data collection or data production is a very expensive affair. And for us, budgeting is such a key issue, especially for data-related activities, which to some extent rely heavily on donor and external donor funding, and particularly on household surveys. So moreover, these financial resources, when it comes to allocation of gender-related statistical activities, we find that it's a bit low. And also for the gender activities or related issues, the priority is usually not that much. For example, we've been trying to have a time use statistics survey, but due to financial issues and other technical issues, we've been having it on hold. And thankfully, the UN Women, through the Women Count program, they come in and we were able to start it off. It was just a little bit disrupted through the COVID-19 issues. So some other challenges include lacking of a proper guideline for standards on production of disaggregated data. And also we lack a specific legislation to produce gender statistics where data collection agencies, they do not feel that they're obligated to consider any gender dimensions in their data processes. So those are only a few challenges. There are other more, but I feel those are very key in terms of disaggregated data. So we move to possible solutions. So on possible solutions for these challenges, I think enhancement of advocacy and awareness in terms of increasing the advocacy at all levels about the importance of disaggregated data. And also in this, you can also have proper skilled gender focal point persons for advocacy on technical issues in various data production and data use entities, which is very key. We can also look at capacity development, which would incorporate enhancing the skills on data through the training. We can also do this through mentorship. We can also do this through coaching, benchmarking, and also guidance on how disaggregated data can be produced and used. So thirdly, we can also opt for developing new data planning approaches, for example, the Paris 21, they have an amazing tool on advanced data planning. And basically this tool is good for capturing the data demands. It also identifies the data gaps. It also identifies the capacity of the skills and also improves data planning, among other advantages as well. So, and in terms of the coordination, strengthening the national statistical system, which greatly improves the coordination between the relevant stakeholders in the entire NSSS. So the data producers and the users are able to understand each other through the data demand and also the data supply. So another one is on budgetary allocation. It's also possible to lobby for increased budgetary allocation from the government. And I also believe that for us or for any other NSO that rely on the donors, enhancement of the partnership with other development partners and stakeholders for more resources would also be a very key strategy. And lastly, we can also strengthen the policies and the legislative framework that essentially supports development of data. So I think I'm done with my 8 minutes, if I'm not wrong. And thank you, and that's the end of my presentation. And again, thank you for listening.
Great, thanks, Caroline. I think your presentation gives a good scene setting for what we're trying to talk about here today, that, you know, the end product of, you know, survey results on a website, there's so much that goes into it before it gets there, beyond just the technical, the skills, the capacity, the financial resources. So that's great. You had also mentioned capacity development as a solution, and we'll hear more from Lauren in the hour about that. So nicely queued up there. So before we get to Lauren, I'd like to turn to Mike, our colleague at the Office of National Statistics, to share some learnings from the Inclusive Data Charter Group, specifically on different methods that he's seen work, that the champions have taken on to spread disaggregation priorities across their organization. So Mike, with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, well.
Excellent. Okay, so yeah, thank you for letting me speak here today. As has been mentioned, I work at the Office for National Statistics in the UK, but my role is primarily focused on giving technical advice to the Inclusive Data Charter, which is this initiative set up by the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. So the point behind the Inclusive Data Charter, or the IDC as I may refer to it going forward, is to increase awareness around disaggregated data generally, and also aims to play a part in mobilizing political support for strengthening data systems in order to provide that, in order to improve the inclusivity of those systems. So the IDC has a few different ways to build this awareness. So it advocates for organizations to prioritize that inclusive data as part of their commitment to SDGs. So as we've already heard, inclusive data is inbuilt within the Agenda 2030, and it's really already inbuilt. It's just about making sure that stats offices are aware that it's this key inbuilt part of the SDGs. So one of the ways which we try and do that is to make these organizations accountable by encouraging them to make public commitments towards prioritizing inclusive data. So as part of joining the IDC, each champion must develop their own unique public-facing action plan, which outlines these commitments. This allows champions to build around their existing organizational priorities and national strategies. So Caroline's already mentioned NSDS, the National Strategies for Developing, so already mentioned those, so we can work around those existing priorities. So it's not asking organizations to do anything particularly new. They should already have these priorities. It's about building momentum around those strategies that already exist. This alignment is quite key. It highlights how these targets of inclusive data fit within the wider data ecosystem of an organization. And also the fact that these action plans are public facing helps to enhance the transparency, and it really helps to maintain the accountability of those action plans once those commitments have been made, really make sure that those organizations are delivering on those priorities and they're not just empty words. So we have lots of champions for the IDC from different backgrounds, and they have come into the IDC through different means. So I'm going to go through a few different ways we've seen inclusive data try and be pushed through an organization. So the first example I'm going to give is sort of that top-down learning. So this usually comes when the head of an organization, whether that is a minister, a chief statistician, or a CEO, advocates for inclusive data across an organization. So this usually leads to it's kind of usually the easiest way to implement, as teams are kind of mandated to take action on this. But it does cause problems of buy-in at the working level of an organization, as sometimes those teams who are responsible for carrying out that work aren't aware of why that's important, and they're not necessarily aware of those benefits, especially if it can cause additional work for their teams. Another kind of scenario we're seeing quite regularly is what I've referred to as a kind of a grassroots example. So this is where those working level teams, whether they're data collection teams or policy teams, kind of individually see a need for and a value in inclusive data. So this can lead to lots of those teams kind of getting together, kind of helping to push throughout the organization the message that this is why we need disaggregated data, this is why it's important, and this is why it's an essential part of what an organization needs to achieve. So this one, usually the organizational buy-in comes quite easily because you already have multiple teams and multiple points across an organization seeing the value in the work. But it can sometimes take time for the correct procedures and processes to be put into place to actually achieve plausible outcomes in terms of inclusive data for that organization. And kind of the final situation and scenario we've seen is what I'm calling a lateral push. So this is kind of where one part of an organization really sees the value of inclusive data and is trying to push that inclusive agenda across an organization. This is probably one of the most common scenarios we're seeing with champions in the Inclusive Data Charter. And unfortunately, it can be kind of the hardest to implement because it's kind of one team or one focal point of an organization trying to go out and get buy-in from elsewhere in the organization. So I've got a few examples of how champions in that final scenario have made a success of going about that. So these are where kind of smaller parts of the organization are trying to spread that message and trying to get that institutional buy-in across the organization. So I'm going to start with a civil society example. So I realized that it's not a national stats office, but I feel like it's important to take those examples and use them where we can, because they're still very beneficial. So the first example is going to come from the charity Sightsavers. So Sightsavers have been involved in the Inclusive Data Charter from the very early days. But what they've done is they've used the action of signing up and committing to the Inclusive Data Charter and the production of their action plan to kind of build and elevate the significance of Inclusive Data Charter internally across the entire organization. So they've used the creation of an action plan and the public commitment to really ramp up that internal engagement, make sure that all teams are across the organization kind of aware of what's going on and the commitment that has been made. Now, this has led to strengthening of their ability to collect disability disaggregated data in a more systematic way across all of their country program work. So they've used that platform to create a real change that affects their program work at a systematic level that can be seen as a real benefit. And so there's a solid outcome from the work of joining the IDC. So again, it's about making sure that they're, so it's about making sure that the action plans are not, again, not just empty words, but the actions are coming about from those. Another example from one of our champions about how they've managed to get this get buy-in across an organization is to create an accountability framework for their inclusive data program. So they have, as part of their action plan, they may have a multitude of different actions that they want to complete, different outcomes and objectives, and they have made teams responsible for those objectives. And in doing so, they have increased the internal buy-in, because to create that accountability framework, they've had to go out to those teams. They've had to, so in this case, those teams are key stakeholders. They have had to understand the needs, the restrictions and the objectives of those teams. And they've had to align the needs, objectives and restrictions of those key stakeholders to their accountability framework and therefore their action plan. So then that kind of gets everybody who's involved within the organization, inclusive data, on the same page, working towards the same goals, and really aligning those incentives to make sure that all parties are finding value in the work that's being carried out. So far I've kind of focused on internal collaborations, but I think external connections can be just as valuable as well. When we're looking at national stats offices, those external connections can be in other government departments, other ministries. And I think getting buy-in and having those conversations with those parties and those stakeholders can really help to also increase the internal buy-in, because it looks good if NSOs are involved in these things, and it has knock-on benefits for the organization themselves. So an example of this that I'm looking at is from DANE, which is the National Stats Office of Colombia. So they started off with a team with an in-house team focused on gender statistics, boosting the production and mainstreaming of these gender statistics in the stats office. But they realized that this wasn't quite doing enough, and even though it was doing really good work, it wasn't quite going far enough. So they built on that group, and they've led to the setting up of a differential and intersectional focus group, which is a multidisciplinary group composing of multiple national level actors. So it includes statisticians, economists, I think it has a psychologist and an anthropologist as well as other advisors. So they've widened that stakeholder group and made sure that they've moved outside of their internal organization to really maximize the impacts that they can have there. So this group's had some pretty key successes to date. So they've piloted new survey questions and methodologies to capture more inclusive data. They've also developed new disaggregation guidelines on key disaggregation dimensions that are applicable across the statistical production process. So you can see there are some really key values in moving outside of the organization as well. But also, as I say, that's had knock-on impacts about the buy-in of inclusive data internally within the Stats Office as well. And you can go further than that on external collaborations. External connections can also help to publicize these successes for an organization on that wider stage, on the international stage as well. And they can open up more collaboration opportunities, which in turn can lead to greater improvements in the inclusive data arena. So as a final point, I'd like to say is that the Inclusive Data Charter, as I mentioned, it has champions that are from NSOs to CSOs, and from that group, that diverse group, you get a very diverse set of skills and expertise. And we're trying to encourage champions to so that all champions are benefiting from expertise within that group. And that's, we're encouraging champions to share both successes as well as difficulties, things that aren't working well as well, because other champions may have either come across those issues before or may be planning to do something very similar, and they may face those and may save resources by avoiding those same mistakes that have already been made. So some of the key skills that some of our champions have, so we have champions working on things like data linkage, use of admin data, use of system-generated data as well, just to name a few. So we're really hoping that that knowledge can be shared between champions within the initiative to kind of help benefit all of the members within the group. Yeah, just finally to mention that the charter itself is open to trying to help all organizations to kind of reach their inclusive data charter potential. So if anybody would like to get in touch, is interested in becoming a champion or just wants some help and advice, then please do reach out and get in touch.
Great. Thank you, Mike. I like hearing the different methods of advocating for inclusive data disaggregation, especially, the strengths and weaknesses of both. It's a good recognition that I think there is no one size fits all approach to how, this might work in a specific context. So, Lauren, I'd like to now turn to you as our last but not least speaker to hear about ongoing efforts at Paris 21 to build soft skills within the partner countries, and why this type of capacity matters for disaggregation and gender data. So over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Deirdre, and to Data2X and Open Data Watch for the invitation, and to my co-panelists for really setting up an interesting discussion. So I want to start with a little bit of framing. When we're talking about disaggregation, whether we're talking about harnessing new data sources that some of my colleagues have mentioned today, like administrative data or citizen-generated data, or we're talking about enriching an existing data production process, like a survey or a census, what we're talking about is essentially a process of change, and it has to be rooted in problem identification. What we find is that NSOs and NSS institutions often struggle with being disconnected from data users and other ecosystem actors, which cuts them off not only from these alternative data sources that could potentially provide some solutions, but also from the users and use cases that can help motivate that business case for why disaggregation matters. And ultimately, this transcends just a technical skills gap, and it highlights a need for strategic investments in soft skills to manage change processes in existing data production lines and to expand the lens to this wider ecosystem. So one of the things that we've done at Paris 21 is start to adopt a more holistic approach when we're thinking about capacity development in NSOs and the NSS. And we've done this by developing a new framework that we call Capacity Development 4.0, or just CD 4.0 for short, which essentially captures different capabilities across 5 target areas, namely resources, skills and knowledge, management, politics and power, and incentives. And when we're looking at those 5 targets, we're looking across 3 different levels. We're looking at the individual level, the organizational level, and the system level. And what we find is that a lot of interventions, whether about disaggregation or other issues of capacity and data production, often focus on issues around skills and knowledge, and they tend to be very technically focused, and issues around resource mobilization, which is of course really key, but it's not the only issue. So one of the ways we've started to use this new framework is by incorporating it into assessment processes. One of them is a new gender statistics assessment framework that we developed with UN Women under the Women Count program that Caroline mentioned earlier. And essentially this new framework analyzes both data gaps, actually using the ADAPT tool that she mentioned as well, and capacity gaps, and looking at how these 2 things connect and relate to each other. We're piloting this in 9 countries, and we've had some key findings coming through showing how soft skills are actually really embedded and connected to the challenges we're facing in terms of making progress in gender data and disaggregation. First is that gender statistics and disaggregation is often treated like a nice to have or an extra activity. And this ultimately affects the enabling environment and resources that are available to improve disaggregation. It also creates a sort of informality that ultimately really reinforces the need for skills in things like negotiation and managing competing priorities and strategic networking at an individual level. And when we're thinking about the individual level in this area, we find that focal points for gender are often drawing on strong personal motivation. They're often female. And they're working in cases even where political support and resources may be lacking. Those are problems that Caroline also highlighted earlier. And the main thing is that when they're working in these environments, they're working in often very unstructured ways. So there's not necessarily formal coordination mechanisms to work even within the NSS, much the less with some of these other actors who may have these really critical data sources. So when we're thinking about how to target some of these challenges, we're looking at a couple different approaches. One way we're thinking about is a really kind of direct approach, which is through management training. So we've been developing over some time now some management training programs targeted at senior level leaders in NSO institutions, and are now working to adapt that to middle management as well. We actually held one of these trainings at a regional level in Senegal last year, and was looking specifically at issues around change management, NSS modernization, and capacity development within institutions. And what we find is this regional approach is actually really helpful, and it offers opportunities for peer learning and knowledge exchange that can draw out some of these softer skills challenges that leaders are trying to tackle that are often embedded in a technical problem like disaggregation. So one is that senior leaders are recognizing that challenges related to the workforce are about often also retaining and motivating talent. So this has to do with how you're setting up incentives or the organizational culture in the organization. And this is also related to issues of advocacy and how to get issues like gender and disaggregation on the agenda. Ultimately, that's connected to managing across different levels. So how are you engaging with governance mechanisms up top? How are you getting this on the political agenda? That's a leadership challenge. And that ultimately, many of these leaders are also grappling with the challenge of reorganization to accommodate some of these new players and actors that they recognize are really critical to targeting data gaps around disaggregation and gender and others. A second way that you can approach this is actually a more projectized approach. And this is something we've done in using citizen-generated data working on one of our gender statistics pilots in the Maldives. So we finished our gender statistics assessment, and we basically used that momentum, that process of engaging with these stakeholders and highlighting these gaps to launch a process of drawing in civil society organizations into the conversation. And this was actually baked into the validation process for the assessment itself. And what we found is projectizing immediately after an assessment process like this essentially problematizes the challenge of strategic networking that a lot of these actors are facing when they're thinking about gender and disaggregation. And we're complementing that also with facilitating a process of formalizing a coordination mechanism between the NSO and the lead institution on gender. So all these things are kind of happening in a way that's connected and symbiotic. And this is ultimately empowering the NSO to develop productive, effective dialogue and relationships with data users and producers, and to develop their skills in communication, negotiation, and problem solving in a really hands-on way. And one of the things we're also doing in this context is also connecting these softer skills to the technical challenges that NSOs are grappling with when they're looking at how to use a new data source to solve a disaggregation problem. So we're looking at how to bake in some activities on quality assurance and data integration at the same time that we're looking at these soft skills gaps as well. So to kind of sum up, improving disaggregation is ultimately a change process in the way that NSOs and data producers do business, and it needs to be embedded in demand in order to mobilize the resources and political support needed for that process. And this ultimately requires a more holistic approach to the way that we think about capacity development that looks at both technical and non-technical capabilities and how that might affect the landscape of disaggregation. And ultimately, interventions to strengthen soft skills can be addressed through a number of approaches, one being a direct approach that develops curriculum specifically targeting those soft skills gaps. And the other might be a more projectized approach where you're developing soft skills at the same time that you're looking at a technical project to address these data gaps. And ultimately, that's what I have today. I'm very keen to take your questions, and thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you. Over to you, Deirdre.
Thank you, Lauren. It's always great to hear examples and country case studies when we talk about some of these larger topics to root them in, what's actually happening. So we're going to turn to Q&A now. I'm going to try to bring my panelists back on the screen. I hope you're now seeing all of us. So we've had a pretty active chat. I have a lot of notes in my Word document, but I'm going to focus on hearing from the audience. So I'm just going to read through some questions that I've assigned to each of our speakers, and we'll go through them, and I'll read all three first and then turn to the speakers. So Mike, we have a few questions for you, and I'm bundling them here, and I hope you can speak to both in your answer. But the audience wants to know if you can give some specific examples on the contents of the action plans. What types of calls are being made in them specifically in terms of the disaggregated and inclusive data? And also a question on the side of impact of the charter. It's one thing to promise, it's another thing to implement and deliver. And if you can speak on, some of the monitoring on how successful it's been and how that's also embedded into the process. For Caroline, I have two questions for you on some of the success that the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics has had on both the upcoming economic survey that has done a good job of including sex disaggregation in it, and also a question on I'm laughing because Caroline is clapping. I know you can't see all of us just yet, but I'll hopefully get to that in a second. And the other question is around the 2019 census, that there were a reported number of intersex people in the census, and if you can discuss perhaps with both of those examples how the case was made and how those goals were achieved for those two different data collection efforts. And lastly, Lauren, I'd like to hear from you, as a organization that's really quite global in reach with the country partners, how you see COVID-19 and what the world is going through right now as a, hate to call it an opportunity, but, a chance for us to continue to advocate and raise political attention on disaggregated, timely data for a range of people. So let's see, I will just take a second here, if you can bear with me to try to get our lovely panelists on stage as well. Okay, and we'll see if that worked. If not, we'll just continue to spotlight the one speaker as they move through. So Caroline, in a few minutes, can you speak to the questions I had raised?
Okay, thank you so much, Didier, for the questions. So, in terms of the economic survey, it has been quite a journey. So we have been doing a lot of advocacy and a lot of education or on why we need a specific chapter on gender and development. So we attempted last year, but it was not successful. I think just some little bit of technical issues. But for this year's publication, we put in the work. We even had a separate technical working committee literally working on the chapter. And we are glad finally it's there. I'm so happy. It's so good to see a product that you've been working so hard on eventually on the publication. So the chapter on gender and development essentially is just talking on three basic, very key thematic areas, which you can actually access it through the internet or through the online. I hope next year we are going to do some little bit of improvement on it, and we would appreciate some feedback from you guys once you go through it. And on the 2019 population and housing census, so it also took a lot of discussions on why we needed the third gender included in the question. However, we had responses on that specific questions, but the percentage of the third gender, it's not that much. It's a 0 point something, but I think it's somewhere to start. So we'll continue having it in our surveys. And yeah, it's a good start for us to do it. And also on the, in terms of the monographs, which we usually do after each and every population and housing census, we're also planning to have a very comprehensive gender dimensions monograph that would essentially have a lot of dimensions or a lot of gender relations in the different thematic areas in the entire 2019 census. I think I've answered, I hope I've answered your questions.
Yes, thank you, Caroline.
Welcome.
Lauren, I think before I go to you, Lauren, I'm gonna go to Mike. So Mike, can you please speak to these specific examples in the action plans, as well as what sort of monitoring for progress is also built in?
Yes, certainly. So something to say about the action plans. Because they're all personalized, there is a lot of variation between them, and the variation in the types of organizations that we have involved means that there is a lot of variation. So there's no one prescriptive way to write an action plan, and we actively encourage champions to make action plans that are unique to them. The reason being for that is it goes back to what I was saying previously about alignment to existing strategies. It also means that if they're personalized, they are more likely to actually follow through with those commitments that they've made, rather than being prescriptive, something that we say they have to do. So specific things on the action plans do vary massively between the champions. I'm sure after the webinar we can share a link to the action plans online. As I say, they're all public facing, so you can see them all online afterwards. But just to mention a few kind of examples. So from a stats office perspective, some of our champions are looking at things like standardization of terms, which can be a key thing in data disaggregation. Some of our civil society organizations that are kind of network organizations, they have a real focus on advocacy across their network. And some organizations are focused specifically on SDG indicators. So going to the ONS action plan, for example, that where I work, our action plan has a big focus on specific indicators. So it will be, we want to add these disaggregations to this specific indicator. So it varies massively as to what's included in those action plans. But I think that's a real benefit of the IDC. As I say, they're all personalized, and so that makes it much more likely that these champions are going to follow through with those actions that they've committed to. In terms of monitoring, we have an annual monitoring scheme to try and make sure that champions are succeeding in carrying out the actions that they've committed to, and also equally as important, finding out if they're not succeeding in certain areas, why they're not succeeding. And as I mentioned before, sharing those pitfalls with other champions so that those common pitfalls are aware and obvious to all the other champions, so they don't make the same mistakes if they're avoidable. We also have fairly regular champions calls where champions can share successes or learnings with other champions as well. So there are some monitoring mechanisms within there. We also have some champions now who are looking to rewrite their action plans. So we want these action plans to kind of be fluid documents where, as things are kind of ticked off and completed, champions can add new objectives to those action plans. What we don't want is things to fall off their action plans because they're just kind of too hard to do. So we're looking at ways to make sure that if things are removed from the action plan and haven't been completed, there's kind of an accountability mechanism there so that we know why those things haven't been completed and why there's been that change. You know, is it an organizational priority change? Is it because you tried to do something and there was real difficulties, there was capacity restrictions and that kind of thing. So there are mechanisms in place for that monitoring. And as I say, we have had champions who are now getting to that point where they've completed a lot of the actions on their plan and are now looking to create a kind of version 2 of those action plans.
Great, thanks, Mike. And we've had a request to, I think, to share the action plans or a link to them. So if you can throw that in the chat while we go to Lauren, that would be super helpful. And so Lauren, over to you to hear more about how this, gender disaggregation fits within the context of COVID. And if you have any examples or country case studies that are, forging ahead in terms of collecting the right gender data to understand how COVID is impacting women.
Sure. Obviously, this is a question that is on all of our minds right now. I think one of the things that's really quite apparent is COVID-19 is a real data moment. More people are looking at data and trying to find the right information. It's really just the volume of demand and the attention it's getting is very high. So in that sense, without sounding opportunistic, it is on some level an opportunity. And what you're also seeing at the same time is the gender advocacy groups are really getting out there and getting out front. The gender dimension and the disaggregation issues associated with the crisis are being pretty clearly framed. And so that does, I think, create a real window to start having more intentional conversations. That said, what you're also seeing is that NSOs and NSS institutions are facing a real capacity crunch right now. They have rising demand and at the same time, like really substantive constraints on their ability to deliver data, just on even a practical level. And so we have to adjust to a different way of doing business. This is something we're actively doing at Paris 21 by moving to more remote forms of engagement. And Deirdre, to your point, I mean, I think we've been really excited by some of our gender pilots, how they're keen to forge onward, and even on remote engagement. And that's actually, I think, a really powerful force in terms of building country ownership and building some momentum internally in an institution to take this on board in a substantive way. But it doesn't change the fact that getting gender, getting disaggregation onto the agenda is and has been and will be a challenge. And I think it's whether or not we can kind of use these messages that are coming from advocates, and some of this is about the ecosystem engagement piece. How do we get those civil society organizations involved into this process, so that the demand for data on gender, and that's disaggregated and that can approach the challenge of COVID through a very intersectional lens, I think that will make the real difference. I think the other thing that I think has come up in my colleagues' presentations as well is this is also a real opportunity for peer learning. I think we're seeing a lot of our partners in country, not just on gender, but even on some of our other streams of work, are coming and wanting to learn from each other about how they're able to cope with the crisis, how they're able to, leverage new data sources even at this moment, and adopt new approaches. And so I think that's also something that's really important to clarify. But ultimately, as well, I think one of the things I'm very aware of in when we're talking about gender and disaggregation is oftentimes we think so much about gaps, which are there and they're very important. But also is to use the data you have. Oftentimes there is gender data that already exists, and it's not necessarily packaged and presented in ways that decision makers can use. And that ultimately is a way to really make the case for why gender data should be on the agenda at this moment. And so that's another piece of this ultimately, is how do we use the resources that exist while they're still current, to really raise the visibility around gender inequality and how it might play out in the future under COVID. Back over to you.
Thanks, Lauren. I was jotting notes down as you were speaking, because I think your comment on peer learning is so relevant just for the host of these webinars, because it's the Gender Data Network, and that's exactly what this network has been set up to try to do as well. Having 15 countries with focal points in each of them to share their own experiences on pre-COVID, post-COVID, whatever it is, to have that link to learn from each other. And Caroline, just in our last few minutes, I do want to take advantage of having you online with us just to speak briefly on Kenya's adaptation to COVID in terms of their gender collection efforts, how it's been within the National Bureau of Statistics, and what sort of leadership has emerged, or skills have been necessary to adapt to a crisis like this.
Okay, so definitely business is not as usual due to the COVID-19 impact. And this also is affecting our resources, because most of the resources have been geared towards or concentrating towards the pandemic. But on data collection, we have to resort to CATI, which is the computer-aided telephone interview methodology, which is quite challenging in the fact that even the trainings, we are having to do them online. And this is something we are doing for the first time. And also the CATI itself comes with its own challenges. Not forgetting that you do not want your questionnaire to be pretty much long. So you find out that you're having to slash some questions so that you go as minimum or as basic as possible. So you don't want to do a questionnaire and which is more than, 15 minutes, 20 marks. So that one also affects your data quality as well. So we are currently doing a survey on the economic impact on COVID-19. So it's having a few modules: labor, transport, rent, health, security, knowledge of COVID, and a question also on timing. So we are yet to see, and we are yet to analyze the data to see whether there's anything that could really imply that CATI is not that effective for us. So even the technical meetings, planning for the survey itself, the entire process has had to be done through the online, and with the challenges of the internet, working from home, it's really something that is not quite something to really be happy about. So that is what you're facing right now. Also, the UN Women, we are also partnering with them. They're doing, they're trying to also conduct their own survey on COVID, but theirs is a rapid assessment. It's not, it's just like a quick one. And the beauty of it, we've been able to exchange their data collection tools with ours. So we've been able to slash down the questions that we had in ours. And the questions in their questionnaire, they've been able to add modules such as protection and security, something also on the water and sanitation, things like the burden of care, which are more comprehensive than what we had in ours. They've also been able to do something more on the GBV, which is very interesting to see how it will come out through the CATI. So we've had to adapt. Basically, we just had to do things in a different and approach a survey in a totally different way.
Yes. Yeah, Caroline, I think that's certainly the case across the country right now in adapting, and we're nearing the hour, and I have so many follow-up questions for you on the specifics on the what kinds of disaggregations are these surveys collecting? Do they go beyond sex? Is it regional? All of these other questions. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so I do want to take the last minute just to wrap up, to thank our organizers at UNECA and Data2X for putting this webinar together. There will be additional webinars as part of the series, so please continue to look out for the next one scheduled. We'll share it on our websites, on Twitter as well, so you can hopefully join us for our third of the series. And I would also like to thank our speakers, Caroline, Mike, Lauren, for joining us today to speak to this issue that could certainly use another hour of conversation. But I do want to allow the rest of us to get on with our work day. So thank you again. Thank you to our audience, and I hope everyone stays well and take care. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.